Isocrates' interest in the power of the word wasn't something that was unique to him. The sophists had been interested in rhetoric for a long time, and particularly how they could make the weaker argument the stronger. But Isocrates thought that rhetoric could do a whole lot more than that, and basically one of his strongest points is that the power of the word is what makes us, humans, different from animals. And to use a quotation from him, he said, "We're inferior to many in swiftness and in strength, and in other resources, but," he said, "we're superior because of our power to persuade each other and to make clear to each other whatever we desire." So a lot of the views that Isocrates has about the power of the word and rhetoric come out in a composition that he has called Nicocles, which is written in the voice of the king of Cyprus, who's called Nicocles. And so a lot of what he talks about is defending monarchy as an ideal, which is very odd because Isocrates is a devout Athenian democrat. But by using the king as speaker, Isocrates is able to highlight the importance and power of the word both to rulers and subjects. Rulers and what the word allows them to do, and subjects so they can be aware of what is being done to them. This makes the word more than just a tool used by the speaker. The word instead becomes a dialogue where the audience is an interlocutor. The companion piece to today's lecture is called To Nicocles, which Isocrates wrote as a letter to the monarch explaining to him how to best rule his people. What both texts have in common, aside from Nicocles himself, is a love of the power of the word. However, while Nicocles has the hymn to Logos, which we'll focus on in that piece, and it's in the beginning, our interest in To Nicocles is drawn in the conclusion, where Isocrates defends his platitudes based on the power of rhetoric to constitute an audience and draws connections between an individual's self-interest and the common interest. Finally, Evagoras is written as a funeral speech in praise of Nicocles' father, and the section we're focusing on in that one is fairly early on, where Isocrates makes a distinction between prose orations and poetry. This is a distinction that's important to Isocrates, and we'll explain how and why that is.
There had been paeans of praise for the dead produced, but the only ones in prose were written as speech exercises with mythological subjects. Isocrates writes Evagoras under the self-imposed burden of abandoning advantages that poets have of many embellishments of language, and getting to use meter and rhythm, as well as words now exotic, now newly coined. Prose oratory, by contrast, was just concerned with the facts, and had to use only words in current use. This seems like a rather odd argument to be making at the beginning of a funeral oration, but remember that this wasn't really a speech meant for the edification of a dead man, nor of his living progeny. The speech was, just as much as those other prose encomiums written for mythological subjects, meant as a display speech to showcase Isocrates' talent and answer his critics. The foremost critic of rhetoric in the ancient world was Plato, who consistently aligned rhetoric as a form of poetry rather than a formal technique. The difference was important. Great poets, after all, are born, not made. But the sophists, including Isocrates, were basing their financial livelihood on the idea that they could teach other people to be great orators. From Plato's point of view, this made them no better than conmen and hustlers, trying to make a quick buck by selling snake oil to a gullible audience. Isocrates counters that greater license is given to poets than ever to a prose composer, and that this difference somehow makes a difference. But how? Why is this really such a big deal? Let's see if our resident expert has a few minutes to help us out. His conversational etymologies have been known to win the phone numbers of even the most nubile of supermodels, whom he then never calls. When the Dos Equis man is driven to drink beer, he is the cause. It is said that even the most devoted of philologists love him more than their words. Some call him a myth, others a legend. Some a story to frighten small children. We call him Classics Man.
Caverte Partenai, I'm going to be a bit busy. I'll be back later though. There's some Greek to translate.
So you want to know about poetry, eh? No problem. The Greek word was poema, which means a made thing. There's even a Greek verb, poieia, which means make. Art, by the way, has similarly interesting valences, but it comes from the Roman side of things. After all, art is the same root as artificial, artifice, artisan, etc. But from the Greek, only poem remains. You could poieio a meal, you could poieio a poem, you could even poieio a speech. So, what's all the big fuss about, yeah? The big deal was that the Greeks had another verb for making things, tekneomai, which means to make things by technique. So a poieio made thing was a different kind of thing than a tekneomai made thing, and never the twain shall meet. It's kind of like the difference between art and science that we have. Have you ever heard the expression that cooking is more of an art than science? I had a roommate once, real putz of a guy. He followed the directions for a Papa John's pizza totally faithfully. Put the pizza in the oven, turned the oven up to 400 degrees, and came back in 12 minutes to take it out. But the directions never said to remove the pizza from the plastic wrap. The place smelled like burnt plastic for a month, and the guy was never allowed to cook in our kitchen again. But in that same sense, that's the same difference between an art and a science. You follow directions of a science, every time you get the same result. With cooking, not so much. Just so with poieio versus tekneomai. And at this point in Western civilization, the distinction started to be a difference that made a difference, if you know what I mean. With Plato firmly denigrating rhetoric, saying that it was a poieio-made kind of thing, not a tekneomai-made thing, and therefore was not the kind of thing you could teach other people to do.
So to Nicocles excuses its somewhat fortune-cookie advice by resorting to a curious bit of audience building. So what he does is he calls out the hoi polloi for their preference for fun stories instead of good sound moral advice, and then kind of points out that even those moral maxims that everyone agrees on are seldom acted upon. So he does this for about 3 sections, and then he wraps up by addressing Nicocles directly. So he says, I've dwelt on these matters because I think that you, who are not one of the multitude, but a king over the multitude, ought not to be of the same mind as men at large. You ought not to judge what things are worthy, or what men are wise by the standard of pleasure, but to appraise them in the light of conduct that is useful. So the king's business is not to be entertained by cleverly worded paradoxes, but to get into the nuts and bolts of what is useful. Nicocles at this point finds himself in a bit of a predicament. If he admits how boring Isocrates' advice was, then he looks like the basest peasant around. So if he wants to appear kingly and good, in the useful sense of good, then he'll have to find Isocrates' advice interesting and helpful. So Isocrates has right there performed what he claims Logos is capable of doing, making an audience be what it is. Of course, he did all of this in Greek, and despite Norbert's excellent effort, some of how he did it gets lost in translation. For help on some key Greek terms, we turn to the 3-time winner of Best Dressed Classicist, Classics Man.
Good one, Barack. Yeah. Oh, looks like I got another call coming in, alright? Yeah, I'm always so busy, you know what I mean? Hey, next time the world's in peril and it needs an exegetic reading of Hesiod to save it, you give me a call, alright? No. Thanks, Mr. President, but you don't have to thank me. You should probably thank the dative instrument. So you want some more Greek, eh? Let's take a look at the pattern of Isocrates that's a little bit hard to see in the English translation. That's not a knock on Norbert. There's nothing wrong with the translation, actually. It's just that Greek likes to do some things with words that's, really hard to carry across into another language, if you know what I mean. So we're going to look at 2 words in sections 43 and 45 of Nicocles. These 2 words, Norbert translates the first as counselors, and the second as best interests. They are originally symbolos and synferanti. The first is a noun and the second a participle, which do a lot more in Greek than they do in English, but alas, this is not a Greek grammar course, so you're going to have to miss out on the awesomeness that is the Greek participle. What both words have in common is that the prefix "soon," which is in a preposition that generally means something like with or together. This sense of withness and togetherness is what gets lost in translation, and is a bit too important to just let it stay lost. First, sumbulos, which is translated as counselors. It literally says, a planner with, or together planner, which really is the same as a good counselor does in English, you know? They plan with you, not without you. A counselor who plans for you but without you? That's not really much of a counselor now, is it? That's more like a ruler. Still, the implicit togetherness of counselor is made explicit in the Greek, and let's assume that it was for a good reason, eh? Finally is sum ferente, which is translated as best interests, and here things get even more interesting. The word literally says bear with, or bear together, but often it has a meaning of being profitable, or being useful, or being advantageous, all of which kind of say the same thing, doesn't it? This speaks to the idea behind the idea of unity being a desired good. The word that says bear together means be profitable. The equivalence is pretty easy to spot. Togetherness was advantage, was usefulness, was profit. Think about that the next time you hear or say a word such as politics, police, or polite, all of which come from the Greek word polis, which means city, the actual physical embodiment of bearing things together. These aren't the only times Isocrates uses a word with sun in its prefix attached, and whether it was through deliberate design or subconscious preference, the words all drive one particular point home. Logos brings people together. It is what it does, first and foremost, before it can do anything else. Information, after all, cannot be conveyed without there being someone else who's entered into a conversation for you to convey it to. The sun is the power of logos. It is the bringing people together with one another, even if only through conversation. But perhaps it could bring people together into something even greater.
What is Isocrates trying to do by pointing to the power of the word? His big project, we have to remember, is the Panhellenic project, where he's trying to unite all of Greece and show that there's no difference between an individual's interest and the common interest. In To Nicocles, Isocrates does not distinguish between self-interest and an individual's best interest, the common good. With the aid of logos, as he explains in the Hymn to Logos, we advocate our own desires and persuade one another as to how to best form cities and institutions. This kind of engagement is a kind of symphony, symphone, which literally means same sounds, but has come to mean being in harmony, which really isn't that far off from the literal translation as we might at first think. The opposite, and what Isocrates was doing everything he could to prevent, was cacophony, cacophone, all the sounds being discordant. It was logos that allows us to educate others on what is true and lawful, allows us to live in harmony, in symphony, and thus it is entirely appropriate to hum a hymn to logos.
And here we have Athens, paragon of intelligence. Clearly, a wise man.
You have what I want. Gold.
Excellent. The last fool whose gold I don't have is come to me. Bring it, Sparta! Are we not become as gods? Hath I not laid Sparta low? Hath not Athens dominion over all of Hellas, all the world? Dominion, power, wealth beyond imagination. Wrestle.
Gentlemen, stop your quarrel. For do not the Persians have more gold than either of you?
That's an interesting point. So, Voice, what you're saying is that we should unite our common interest into a self-interest that's greater than both of us.
Perhaps it would be advantageous.
What do you say?
Sounds like a plan.
Barbarians, come out and play.
Well, Athens, this could be the start of a beautiful friendship.
I believe I'll go back home. I believe I'll go back home.